Time covers up the past. People and places can become hidden in the undergrowth. But these woods on the edge of the Avon Gorge in Bristol witnessed something special which should never be forgotten. A story of extraordinary generosity, bravery, and the best of humanity during a very dark period in our history. The First World War reached its bloodiest climax at the end of 1916. At the same time, in the southwest of England, a journalist called Archibald Powell is finishing the copy for the latest edition of a magazine all about life at Bishop's Knoll Hospital. Written by patients and the medical staff, it represents a fascinating insight into the story of how, in the First World War, a country house was converted to a fully functioning hospital. A hospital funded completely by the house owners, Colonel Bush and his wife Marjorie, at a cost that today would be close to £10 million. Marjorie Bush acted as quartermaster for the hospital and was later awarded an OBE for her efforts. And Colonel Bush was the commandant in overall charge of the whole operation, so their commitment was far more than just their home and their money. Much that we know of what happened comes from reading the 12 editions of the magazine that were published. There were stories recalled from the time in the front line, and unique reflections from the soldiers and those tending them on what life was like on a daily basis at Bishop's Knoll. What's most remarkable is that all the soldiers in the hospital were Australians. The magazine was called Cooey, a greeting commonly used down under. So what moved the Bushes to convert their home to a hospital? Why was it only for Australians? And what exactly was it like for those young men, scarred by war and thousands of miles away from home? Chris Stevens is a local Bristol historian and a volunteer at the Woodland Trust, the current guardians of these woods. There's no one better to explain the Bishop's Knoll story, as he has researched the whole period extensively when writing a biography of Colonel Bush, including a history of the hospital.
When Bush left school, his brothers had gone into the family firm, and he always wanted to be a farmer. And eventually, to cut a long story short, with a friend of his, he went out to Australia, not wanted to do farming, but he started off with a bit of gold prospecting, which wasn't successful. And then he tried selling horses, and that wasn't very successful. But on the way back from one of these trips, he discovered an area which he thought would be very appropriate for sheep farming. So he started sheep farming. And initially it went very well. At the peak he had 100,000 head of sheep, and eventually came back to England, really because his children got to the school age. And that's when he bought Bishop's Knoll. When the war came, he always felt indebted to Australia. because it made him a wealthy man. He liked the people. So he wanted immediately to have a hospital that was devoted to Australians, but he was told by the authorities that were that to happen, there would have to be Australians in charge of it, and he didn't want that. He wanted to be in charge of his hospital. Fortunately, his brother by that time, one of his brothers was a medic, so he was actually in charge. All the war veterans were supposed to come via him, be filtered, and then put out to the various voluntary sectors. And there were a lot of voluntary hospitals looking after those after they were operated on. But Bush managed to get a special agreement where Australians could come direct to him. And it said that he went down the platform at Temple Mead saying, any Australians, come to my hospital. He built an operating theatre in the front drive of the house, a very modern one. It was greatly approved. And I think he only lost something like 3 soldiers in the course of the war. It had a very, very good record. It was the very best. He wanted them to be treated specially. And the entertainment they put on was terrific. I mean, you look at the programme of the entertainment they put on, almost every day of the week there was something for them to do, quite apart from recovering. There were, of course, people who were confined to bed. At any one time, of the 100 patients he had, 50 of them would be still in bed, having had their operations. But half of them were either recovering in the woods, or else they'd be out on one of the many entertainments. They took them out to all sorts of places, including going down the river, going to Bath. A whole lot of things were laid on for them. Powell had a lot to do with the organising, and essentially the local gentry's arms were twisted, and that's how it happened. And everybody provided everything for free. I mean, the petrol for the trips to take them out, the cost of the boat going down the river. They went to Weston. All these things were entirely done by the locals. Most of the soldiers recovered. They went back into the services. They were shipped back, either back into the forces, or they were repatriated to Australia. At the end of the war, they all, of course, left. The last patient left in February 1919, whereupon Bush hauled down his Red Cross flag, which had been up on the tower. And that was the end of it. And then he went back to being, an ordinary gentleman.
11 years after these events, Colonel Bush asked Powell to write a history of Bishop's Knoll, and it gave him a chance to share key extracts from Cooey and capture the reflections of those who were there at the time.
It was Colonel Bush's idea, and it was he who offered the prize of 6 briar pipes for the winner in a competition for naming the magazine. I can remember the exact words he used.
I have an idea, Mr. Powell, which requires your expertise. The entertainments that you have been so good at laying on, with the help of our Bristol compatriots, have been very well received, and I hope will continue. But I have in mind us publishing a magazine directly from this very hospital, with the content provided by yourself and our patients, for the benefit of their fellow soldiers on the front line. I want you to be the editor, make it all happen. Many of our patients have to spend long, weary hours in bed, and maybe in trying their own hand at literary or artistic efforts, the monotony of hospital life might further be relieved.
And so Cooey was born. It was first intended that this publication should be only a modest record of hospital life. But it became so popular with the Australian forces that its scope was extended, and each month hundreds of copies were distributed. We had excellent articles from our patients, nurses, and contributions such as brilliant cartoons from Private George Holland, who was tragically killed in 1915 before he could make his mark on the world. The editions captured the thoughts of many of the important people in the Bishop's Knoll story, not least the unflagging and always willing nurses.
Perhaps it is in night time that those working in a military hospital realise more fully the grim tragedy of war. During the day, the men seem to have a secret code that compels them to keep a tight hold on themselves. "Shut up and think you're lucky to be alive," they would say to a grouser. And a one-armed Jones will grin with delight if he can fling an orange across the ward and catch Smith unawares. An additional twinge of pain is no matter to either, if it brings a laugh with it. It is in night time that suffering wells uppermost. It is in the stillness afterwards, when wounds have been dressed and the poor fellows sink into a sleep of utter exhaustion, and you are brought up close to the spirit of suffering. You look down at the sleeping faces, some so boyish despite drawn lines of pain, and you see in your mental vision the mothers of these men praying in a distant land.
Some stayed in the hospital for weeks, some for months, and August time was a year and a half. Some, unfortunately, never left. It touched all of us deeply when we lost one of them. It especially distressed the commandant.
We tried all that was humanly possible to save him, but the poor fellow was shot to pieces. We knew he had to die. So we put a nurse to stay with him until the end and to help him through the last hard journey with human kindliness and sympathy. Before the end came, he was wandering in his mind, and from his words, we heard that he had a wife in Australia, and after a quarrel, he had left her hastily and then enlisted. He never saw her again, but in those last few days, his thoughts were constantly of her. In his delirium, he mistook the nurse for his wife and made up the quarrel with her and died quietly, holding her hand in his and soothed by her words.
Many men were lucky enough to be nursed back to life and strength at Bishop's Knoll, only to be sent back to those insatiable trenches by the inexorable need of the war for every man who could hold a rifle. There were no others to fill the empty spaces except those who had been already wounded. For them, Bishop's Knoll was a temporary haven before a return to hell. I know their names well, even today. Jim Dolin, Tiny Ryan, Arthur Fleming. Arthur was one of the best liked of all the boys who came to Bishop's Knoll. He had a glorious baritone voice, and he and the other musical friends had charmed us with their gift of song. Now, voice is silent forever. Cooee ran for 12 editions until it became impossible to get the paper and ink to continue. We were all blessed by time with the convalescents, men whose regard is a treasured possession. Many a name comes to mind, many a face, clear cut and character marked, rises in my mental vision. They've, of course, now gone their ways. Some went back to the turmoil and strife, and some back to Australia. But the pleasure of their presence lingers, and always will linger, as long as memory lasts.
Today, you can still find a few surviving copies of Powell's History of Bishop's Knoll, and all the editions of Cooey can be found online. So all those stories can be discovered by future generations. Colonel Robert Bush died just on the eve of the Second World War, mercifully spared the pain of his 2 sons dying in battle. And Mrs. Bush moved out of Bishop's Knoll. Ultimately, the house was sold for a knockdown price to the Bristol Royal Infirmary, and after being used for nurse training, it finally became disused. The terrace gardens became overgrown and became a secret garden that only a lucky few stumbled upon. The house was sold to a developer who demolished it in the 70s. Some rather innocuous flats replaced the grand old house, but the woods, being too steep for development, were donated to the Woodland Trust. Woodland Trust volunteers cleared the undergrowth, and what was revealed were the old terraces and structures of Colonel Bush's gardens, almost as they were all those years ago. And where patients and nurses walked, there are now memorial plaques that ensure future generations will never forget the acts of the Bushes, their nurses and doctors, the hugely supportive Bristol community, and the bravery and humour of those young Aussie soldiers.